So, today I'm here with Dr. Stephen Sanderson. He is a comparative sociologist and sociological and anthropological theorist who has written or edited 14 books in 21 editions and over 60 articles in journals and edited collections. Most of his work has been devoted to the comparative study of the entire range of human societies, especially the study of long-term social evolution. He contributed to the unification of the social and natural sciences by drawing on sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, human behavioral ecology, cultural materialism, and social evolutionism. Although officially a sociologist, he feels equally at home in anthropology, and much of his research and writing are heavily based on anthropological literature and cross-cultural data collected by anthropologists. He favors a comparative science of all human societies. So, Dr. Stephen Sanderson, the first topic I would like to ask you about is your Darwinian conflict theory. It seems to me that for you, in your opinion, one of the biggest failure of sociology is that sociology didn't take into account the existence of human nature and the important role the human nature plays in the social behavior and organization and functioning of human societies. So you created the Darwinian conflict theory, and you called it theory just for the purposes of simplification, because the Darwinian conflict theory is actually some kind of like large-scale research program in the Likatish terms. So can you tell me something more about your Darwinian conflict theory?
Well, I'll try. That's a very big subject.
Right.
When I was a graduate student in my last year or two, I first began to realize that there was a biological nature to humans, and that this had been almost completely ignored by sociologists. This was about 1971 or 1972. There was no sociobiology or evolutionary psychology at the time. It didn't exist. I wrote a paper for a graduate class I was taking called something like The Implications of the Study of Infrahuman Animals for the Science of Human Behavior. It's been 50 years. I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like that. And I had to rely mainly on the writings of the people called ethologists. Ethologists are people who engage in the study of animal behavior, usually by going out into the field and observing them. So at any rate, I wrote the paper. I don't even know if I can find a copy of the paper anymore, where I may have put it, but it was extremely well received by the professor of the class for which I was writing. So this encouraged me. Well, I didn't do anything with it for a long time, and then when I took my first, after I got my PhD and after I took my first job in sociology as a professor, E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology came out, and that was in 1975, and in the same year, a book by a sociologist by the name of Pierre Vandenberg called Man in Society, a Biosocial View. It came out, and I became re-energized once again to pursue this. And I pursued it for a while. I didn't write anything about it. I taught some of it in my classes, and a long period elapsed in which I really wasn't doing very much with it. But at some point I came back to it and decided to pursue it in a more vigorous way. And I think that's when I began to make contact with the so-called evolutionary psychologists, the people who more or less succeeded the sociobiologists. The evolutionary psychologists say they're different from the sociobiologists, and they are in some ways, but they're more similar than they are different.
Yeah, right.
And so it was at this point that I started pursuing things vigorously. But I realized that evolutionary psychology was almost by definition an incomplete theory. I don't know if the evolutionary psychologists thought that they were developing a complete theory of human behavior. I don't think there is any such thing as a complete theory of human behavior, but they didn't
Right.
have one, and nobody has one, and probably nobody will ever have one. The universe will die and go cold before we have a complete theory of human behavior. But at any rate, I had been working with some other theories, mostly coming from anthropology, and the biggest one was a theoretical approach called cultural materialism, developed by the anthropologist Marvin Harris, and it gave an emphasis to the material conditions, the so-called material conditions of social life, the modes of production and reproduction in shaping the other features of human social life. So I had been working with that for a long time. And but eventually I began to see that it too had limitations. And so I had two approaches. I still called it sociobiology in spite of the evolutionary psychologists trying to get everybody to change their terminology and switch over to evolutionary psychology.
Right.
And so gradually, these things take time, but gradually I began to see that there were similarities between the two approaches and that they could be synthesized. And basically that there was a compatibility between anthropological cultural materialism and sociobiology, and that sociobiology provided some deeper theoretical foundations for cultural materialism. So I came up with this idea of synthesizing the two. And to make a long story short, I gradually came to call the new approach I had Darwinian conflict theory, um, uh, using the term conflict theory based on the ideas of the sociologist Randall Collins. I did a draft. I wrote a book in 2001 called The Evolution of Human Sociality, a Darwinian Conflict Perspective, in which I laid out an early version of this and then gradually over the years began thinking about it. And then and began to develop newer versions, but not publishing them. And then I finally developed a much more detailed and comprehensive version, which I published in a book edited by Jonathan Turner and Alexandra Mariansky, who were my colleagues at the University of California at Riverside. And I published it in, I'm looking for the book here.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah. I published it in this book, Handbook on, you see it? Handbook on Evolution and Society.
Right.
Toward an Evolutionary Social Science.
Yes.
I published the detailed version of it, a much more detailed version of it in that book, which I think appeared in 2015. I haven't done anything with it since. I don't know. I indicated at the end of my discussion of this is incomplete. It can never be completed. I can keep adding to it. I can keep revising it, reworking it, but it can never be complete. And, at some point, maybe it would just die off. And when I die off, nobody will probably. It hasn't generated any real enthusiasm among others. So maybe when I die off,
maybe this interview will change
it will
that.
just disappear. And then who knows, sometimes years later, for some reason, some person is looking through the library and they discover it, and they say, "Gee, I never heard of this. Where's this been all my life?" And they revive it. This sometimes happens. Probably won't happen to me. Won't be so
Right.
lucky, but uh, it
Maybe
could.
they will discover you on the YouTube. Maybe, for example, this interview is going to be your like to recognize you in the years to
Yes, I'm
come.
recognized after I'm no longer around, and I won't be around to see it. Maybe
That's unfortunate.
my children and my grandchildren will recognize it, although
Right.
they probably wouldn't have any interest in it. So you never know what you never know what the fate of these things would be.
Right. Right.
But at any rate, it's a very comprehensive theory, and it deals with all of the major dimensions of social life. Um, uh, Human sexuality, marriage, family structures, um, economic systems, politics, the pursuit of power, the pursuit of wealth, um, and I outline it in a very formal way. It has
Right.
postulates, axioms,
Yes.
theories, and then
Propositions.
and propositions. Um, I think I have about 364 propositions or uh, something like
354. 354.
354, 354. I could add probably another 354, but you have to stop at some point. So it's
Right.
a very comprehensive theory for which I claim there's a lot of evidence. Uh, but of course, all these things have to be revised.
Right.
You have ideas. One of the things I've discovered, I hate to have to say this, but one of the things I've discovered in my career, which is now, I guess it's almost 50 years old,
Right.
after a certain period, you begin to discover you made a lot of mistakes. And a lot of the ideas that you held when you were much younger, you begin to see are not holding up. Uh, New evidence is coming out, which is showing that some of your earlier ideas are, to put it bluntly, they're just wrong. So I've had to reject or repudiate some of my earlier ideas and replace them with later ones. If you have a career long enough, and I've had as I said, about a 50-year career, this is going to happen to you. Unless your ideas were so good in the beginning that they don't need that much revision, but that
Right.
would be rare, a rare occurrence. Mostly what happens, I think, is that in most cases, people cling to the ideas that they've always had. They're reluctant to admit that they made a mistake,
Right.
and that new evidence, new ideas coming along contradict some of the things they said earlier. Uh, they're reluctant to do that, and man, most of them, I think, most of them continue to cling to their ideas forever until they've died, even though they should have given them up.
Yeah.
And what tends to happen, I could go on about this forever, but
Right.
a new generation comes along. Well, the new generation wants to make its own mark. It wants to be original. It wants to begin to create its own ideas. So it has a strong interest in challenging or overturning earlier ideas, establishing their own newer ideas in place of the older ones. But then, of
Right.
course, over
Yeah.
time, they become the older generation, and a new generation emerges to challenge their ideas. This is happening in evolutionary biology right now.
Right.
All kinds of new thinking is occurring, and it is absolutely fascinating. I've read some of it. I don't have time to read all I'd like, but
Yeah.
there are new ideas in evolutionary biology which are seriously challenging some of the old ideas. The idea of evolution is still there. The idea of natural selection is still there, but many of the other ideas are are probably going to be abandoned and replaced by new ones. So even in the natural sciences, new ideas are coming along to replace old ideas. The most sophisticated science we have, of course, is physics, but there's all kinds of stuff going on in physics, challenging old ideas, and there's all kinds of disagreement and debate among physicists. We often think, well, the physicists have figured everything out. Well, they haven't. They haven't. And people have written these books called Dreams. Somebody wrote a book called Dreams of a Final Theory. They think they're at the edge of knowing everything that can be known. Well, this is ridiculous. Nobody is ever going to be there. There are always new things to be known, and there are always old ideas which eventually are shown to have difficulties and need to be. You may not need to completely throw them away, but you need to revise them in certain kinds of ways. This happens in all fields, and in the social sciences, sociology and anthropology, it happens much more rapidly, but it happens in all fields. All fields are in a constant state of rethinking old ideas. We have this COVID-19, right? And I don't know how much attention you pay to that, but we have to follow the science, they say. We have to follow the science. This drives me crazy. What science? There's no one science. There are all kinds of different points of view about the COVID-19. Very, very different points of view. So you can't just say, we follow the science. Well, what science?
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going off on a tangent, but it's extremely important to make the point that ideas are in a constant state of debate and discussion and flux. And most of the ideas that people have don't work out. They go extinct. And then their creators, then they go extinct. And most ideas have a very brief life, if any life at all. So I work within this broad perspective called Darwinian conflict theory. I don't always work within it. And by the way, sometimes I engage with ideas that are outside this, recognizing that Darwinian conflict theory is a point of view which I think is very useful, but it certainly doesn't have all the answers. So I'm still rethinking. I'm constantly rethinking and constantly thinking and still challenging some of the ideas I've been promoting. So that's one way of saying. That's one way of responding to you.
Right. But can you name, for example, some kind of evidence that would falsify the Darwinian conflict theory?
That's an extremely good question.
Right.
At the end of my discussion of Darwinian conflict theory, I take up this question. Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, said, science is about falsification.
Right.
You make statements that are capable of being falsified, that you can never truly verify a theory or a hypothesis, because you can always discover later that there's something out there that will contradict it. Okay, so all theories have to be held in a provisional or tentative way. And so what scientists should really try to do is to falsify their ideas, and you hope then that you fail. Your attempts at falsification fail, and so long as your attempts at falsification fail, you can still hold on to your theory. I list at the end of the discussion of Darwinian conflict theory, I believe it's about 57 pieces of evidence that, if we discovered them, would falsify Darwinian conflict theory, or at least falsify major portions of it, so that it would have to be thoroughly revised. For example, I can't remember all of it. I'd have to go back and look and remember all of them. But a good example would be what we find in human societies. It's the men who do the fighting. It's the men who are more aggressive. It's the men who fight the wars. We find no examples of women who are the primary warriors. And if we found a society or a handful of societies in which it was the women who were the warriors and the men were staying home and looking after the children, um, uh, and it was the women who were invading other bands or tribes, stealing men and bringing the men back to their own village. Uh, if we found that, that would be a falsifying piece of evidence.
Right.
It would falsify, yeah, actually, it would falsify a major assumption of evolutionary psychology and Darwinian conflict theory. But you see, I'm confident in asserting that that's never been found. No society has ever been found in which it's the women rather than the men who are the aggressive, aggressors, the warriors, the capturers of men. No society has ever been found. No society ever will be found, I think. And so I'm confident in asserting that the theory would stand up to that. And that's an easy one because we know there are no such societies. Popper might say, you see, but that's too easy. You've made it too easy. And so just because you find that one thing, it doesn't falsify your theoretical or research program. And that would be right. So that's why I list numerous examples, 50 something, 57 or 52 or something like that. And if we found more than one, say, oh, well, now we have found a society. Oh, look, now we found another society. Now we've begun to find several societies which would do this. Then that would begin the process of falsifying the theory. We would, of course, have to look at other propositions within the theory and see if we can falsify them. And theories get falsified. Most theories are falsified. And Popper is right, I think, to say that this is the method we pursue. We should pursue, but we don't. Scientists don't pursue this because they develop an affection for their theories. They're their theories. They're personally invested in their theories. They want their theories to be true. They debate with their competitors about their theories, and their competitors have other theories. Well, they don't want to just give in to their competitors. They have a vested interest, a strong interest in their theories being true. So they usually try to protect them from falsification. Einstein, though, when he developed his general theory of relativity in 1915, said it needs to be tested. And if we find such and such, my theory will be false. So he was one of the very few scientists willing to have his theory subjected to an empirical test. And in 1919, an experiment was done, and it was consistent with Einstein's general theory of relativity. And so the theory, well, they would probably say the theory is confirmed, even though Popper would say you can't really say that because you could still find other evidence that you haven't yet seen, which would overturn it, see. But Einstein understood the idea that it had to be tested, the theory had to be tested, and it might be wrong, and we're going to try to find out if it's wrong or not. So far, the theory has held up. It hasn't been overturned, and it's been over 100 years now. But of course, Newton's theory of universal gravity held up for about 200 years, and then Einstein came along and overturned it with his new theory of gravity, general relativity. So theories are always in danger of being overturned, and most of them are eventually. Especially in the social sciences, they're always being overturned.
Right. So, Dr. Stephen Sanderson, you also extensively wrote about the human sexuality. For example, in your book, The Human Nature and Evolution of Society. For example, we know that Darwin, in the addition to his concept of the natural selection, he identified another form of selection that he called sexual selection.
Yes.
So natural selection operates on the ability of an organism to find food and protection from the elements and thus to survive. But sexual selection is selection for traits that help organisms to find mates. So, what you can tell you about what can you tell about the working of the sexual selections in humans? What are the most fundamental differences between male and female sexuality
among humans? Human males, human females. There are lots of wonderful examples in the animal world. Well, let me think. I was thinking about that when you said you wanted to pursue the idea of sexual selection, and I thought, gee, how much do I really have to say about that? Because I haven't studied that very much.
Right.
But
I meant human, yeah.
Women do all kinds of things to attract mates, and men do all kinds of things to obtain mates. We generally say that the men propose and the women choose. It's like the peacock, the case of the peacock, where the peacocks strut in front of the females, the peahens, and the peahens tend to choose the peacocks with the most elaborate and beautiful tails and so forth and so on. So in humans, sexual selection is operating on both sexes, and men are looking. What are men looking for in women? They're looking for attractive women. They're looking for young women. They're looking for young women because young women are they're more fertile. They're more likely to get pregnant, to give birth to offspring, and thereby the male promotes his reproductive success. There have been studies by evolutionary psychologists, very, very interesting studies, showing that men prefer a female with a certain type of body shape, and they're particularly looking at the waist to hip ratio. And there have been many studies in various ethnic groups in different countries and so on, showing that the ideal waist to hip ratio is about 0.7. So if a woman has a waist of 24 inches around and hips that are about 36 inches around, that will be a ratio of 0.67, which is very close to the 0.7.
Yeah.
And so men prefer that ratio. They prefer lower ratios to higher ratios. Why do they do that? Well, we believe that women with lower ratios are more likely to get pregnant, more likely to give birth to healthy offspring than women who have high waist to hip ratios. As women age, their waist to hip ratios increase. They can increase a lot. With the obesity problems we have in this country, in the American society, they get much bigger than 0.7. They get to 1.0, and then they get far beyond 1.0. They lose their attractiveness for me, I must say, once they get above 1.0.
I agree.
So there's been sexual selection for waist to hip ratios, and there's some studies that actually show studies of some African populations. I believe the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, a very well-known ethnographic group, showing that there are a lot of men who prefer an even lower than 0.7 waist to hip ratio. Some men were choosing women with 0.6 or 0.65 waist to hip ratios, and then in a few cases, some men were choosing women with 0.55 waist to hip ratios. Some other researchers were sort of creative and innovative. They said, well, we're showing pictures of women from the front. What if we turn them to the side and we look at them in profile? Then the hips flare out a lot. Okay, a lot of men chose that. You see how much the hips flared out, how round everything got. To those who had flatter hips, well, there's obviously a strong correlation between how much the hips flare out and what the actual waist to hip ratio is if you look at women from the front. So that's sexual selection going on. So attractiveness, female attractiveness, males prefer symmetrical faces. Symmetrical faces. I'm looking at your face. It's pretty symmetrical. Yeah,
Thank you.
it's a good symmetrical face. As far as I can tell, if we weren't on Skype and I was face to face with you, I might see a little bit of asymmetry. But both sexes prefer symmetrical faces. Symmetrical faces are indicators of good health. Bad health and trauma or injuries tend to create certain asymmetries. And so people don't know this. This is all going on unconsciously, but there tends to be a dislike or less attraction to asymmetrical faces. And so when people are choosing mates with symmetrical faces, they're choosing, most often they're choosing mates who are healthier, and healthier mates are likely to produce better offspring, maybe more offspring, and so on. So these are two examples of sexual selection. Women are looking for men of high status. They prefer men of higher status rather than lower status. Higher status in traditional societies, in what we call the ancestral environment or the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, women need men to provision them, to provide. Men go out and hunt and they provide food and they help build shelter and so forth and so on. So men who can do those things are valued. High status men are more likely to be able to do those things in a successful way. In fact, that's how they gain their status. They're good hunters. In a hunter-gatherer society, the best hunters will have the highest status and so on. Women may prefer more muscular men because those men are physically stronger, maybe better hunters, maybe better at constructing good shelters and so forth. So those are examples. Women just one more thing. Women advertise themselves.
Yeah.
They paint their fingernails, right? Usually a red tone, although we see different colors now. This is a sexual attractant for men. I find it very attractive. Women use lipstick. They paint their lips red. This is a sexual attractant for men. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of things women do. When women age, what do? They want to look
use the blush. They use the blush for the cheeks.
Yeah, they use the blush for the cheeks. They used the blush for the cheeks. When I was a young boy, my grandmother was always putting on rouge. It was called rouge, French word for red. Blush. I had no idea why she did that. I was maybe 8 years old or 10 years old. Wasn't thinking about things like that. But if she went out somewhere, she thought it was important to put on rouge. It's just part of the way being properly dressed and presenting yourself in a proper way and so on. But the point I was going to make is that when women don't want to get older because everything
Right.
changes when they get
Right.
older. Their waist to hip ratio increases. Um, their their face changes so that they look older. Men are not attracted, by and large, men are not attracted to older women. And so women do all kinds of things to make themselves look younger. The biggest thing I think they do is to color their hair. They want to get the gray out of their hair. I find it very difficult to find women of age 40 or 45 or
Right.
50 who have gray hair. They've colored it out. I said, my daughter has light brown hair. She's 38 years old. I said to her recently, Sarah, I don't see any gray hair. Are you getting any gray hair? Her mother got gray very early on, very early.
Right.
And I said, I don't see any gray hair. Are you coloring it? No, I pull them out. I pull them out. I see them in the mirror and I pull them out.
Right.
Which means she doesn't have too many. Otherwise, she's going to be pulling out a lot of hair.
Right.
But maybe she'll be maybe in 10 years when she's closer to 50, she'll start coloring. Her mother never did this. Her mother never did this. Her mother went gray very early, and she never did this. But that's unusual. She was unusual in that regard. Women want to look younger.
Right. And the makeup they use. The purpose of the makeup is always to increase the parts of the face, never to shrink.
Yes, to remove wrinkles, to make the face look smoother, and
Right.
and if you do those things, the face will look younger. When women get perhaps to be 60 years old, or 65 or 70, and they start looking very old, well, then they go in for plastic surgery.
Right.
And the plastic surgeons try to alter the face in various ways to make the face appear younger. Sometimes these operations work out badly, and the women look far worse than they looked. They might look younger, but they don't look natural. And
Right.
my own feeling is women should just age naturally.
Right.
This is a normal human process, but the women generally don't feel that way. So, but that's sexual selection.
But is there some kind of conflict between the natural and sexual selection in humans?
Yes.
Like that natural selection works at the expense of the sexual selection and otherwise?
Yes.
Other way.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a human example of that. In terms of an animal example, the peacocks with the most beautiful and elaborate tail. Those tails are heavier than smaller and less, excuse me,
no problem,
smaller and less beautiful tails. But if they're heavier, the peacock has more difficulty escaping predators. Right. So that's where a trade-off comes in. If the tail gets too big, the tail gets heavier. If it gets too brightly colored, too big and too brightly colored, then it's more easily noticed by predators. It has more difficulty escaping. And so sexual selection may actually, in that case, work against natural selection. The predator comes along, eats the peacock, and that's the end of the peacock and the peacock's tail. Yeah, there are lots of examples of that. So it seems that evolution has worked out some kind of a balance. So between natural and sexual selection, so it doesn't go too far in one direction or too far toward natural selection at the expense of sexual selection, and the opposite. I'm trying to think of
maybe the big breasts that. Maybe the big breasts. Maybe the big breasts that women have. For example, that is the work of sexual selection. Big breasts.
Might be, yeah.
Yeah, that's attractive for us, for men. But at the other hand, maybe the big breasts increases the chance of the cancer, because there are a lot more cells in the tissues in the big breasts. I think David Barish wrote about that in his.
You could be right, and that's an idea which is testable.
Right.
You ask the gynecologist, do you find more cancer in big-breasted than in small-breasted women? I don't know what the answer. I've never heard the answer to that would be. I've never heard anybody talk about that, but that might be the case. And if it's the case, it would be a good example of what you're talking about.
I think David Barish. Okay.
The big breasts shouldn't get too big, because if breasts get too big, then they're uncomfortable for women. They weight them down, and they make it more difficult for walking and for other kinds of. So some women who get unusually large breasts go in and have their doctors reduce the size of them, so they're more within a normal range.
Right.
I don't think the really big breasts will kill the woman unless there's more cancer, as you suggest. That's an interesting question that should be pursued. See, and that's a very interesting question. Do women? I'm going to ask it.
Right.
I'm going to see my doctor, my general family doctor, at the end of this month, and he's easy to talk to, and I'll bring this idea up. Do you have any knowledge of the relationship between breast size and breast cancer? It may be that there's no relationship.
Yeah, right, of course.
It'd be interesting to find out.
Right.
You could have a master's thesis on that. A graduate student could write a master's thesis. I'll bet there is one. See, if we've thought of it, it's likely somebody else has thought of it.
Yeah.
It's likely. There are a lot of people out there thinking about a lot of things. So
I think I saw it in one of the books of the David Barish. I think he wrote about.
Oh, Barish, David Barish.
Yeah, I think
he
it's
wrote
him.
About that.
I think it's. I can't remember the name of the book. Some interesting title, like what is the role of the female orgasm, and puzzles like that.
Oh yes, that's another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of debate about whether or not the female orgasm is adaptive, or it's simply a side effect of selection for orgasm in the male. The evolutionary psychologist Donald Simons has written on that in his book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, and he concludes that it is a non-adaptive. And I believe that he's right. He presents a great deal of evidence to suggest that it is not an adaptation, but simply a byproduct of an adaptation in the male. But it's still debated.
Right.
I suppose there probably is a PhD dissertation there, or there probably some have been written already. You think, one of the things that a lot of us think is, oh, I have this idea. Yeah. Oh, that's a new idea. It's an original idea.
Right.
Because there's much more prestige given to scientists who have original ideas rather than just copying what others are saying and so on. Then you begin to dig around into the literature and so on. Oh, so other people have thought of that. Oh, quite a few other people have thought. I discover this all the time.
So,
but if you thought of it, if there are very few people working on an idea or working in a general area of research, you might be the first to have thought of it. But if there are a lot of people working in the area, there's a much increased chance that one of those or some of those have thought of it. In the
So,
old days, when Darwin lived, there were very few people working on things. The
mm,
number of scientists was very, very small. And many of them didn't have university teaching positions, so they didn't have students to try out their ideas on or to perpetuate their ideas. But now there are tens of thousands. There are about 12,000 sociologists in the United States. There's probably about 11,000 too many.
right. So, one last thing about this story of human sexuality. Where is the
Yeah.
place for example, for preferential homosexuality in evolutionary terms? What is the story about that?
Well, E.O. Wilson, many years ago, produced an adaptationist theory, and he has clung to this theory right down to the present. I think he's about 90 years old now, or somewhere in late 80s or close to 90. Um, it's a silly theory. It's a ridiculous theory. Um, Homosexuals um, won't have children because they're not mating with women. Male homosexuals are not mating with women. So they won't produce children, but then they can invest in their sisters' children. They can
Right,
be uncles to their
helping raising the
sisters'
children.
children.
Yeah,
It was a silly theory when he first formulated it. It's a silly theory today, and the fact that he still clings to it means he hasn't thought any more about it. He's he's thinking about ants. He's written a whole bunch of books about ants. He's thinking about other things. He's not
right.
thinking much about this. He has hardly any new ideas about human behavior at all. Almost no new ideas at all. Um, at least of a sociobiological nature. I think homosexuality is simply a maladaptation. It's something that has gone wrong in the process of the fetal development, of the development of the embryo. That the developing embryo receives um, too much of the hormone of the opposite sex. A developing male fetus gets too much of a female hormone. A developing female fetus gets too much of a male
Right.
hormone, and this uh, they still develop into male or female, but uh, there's an alteration in the brain, in the part of the brain that controls sexuality, um, which alters their sexual orientation or their preferences. That's what I think, but we don't. The final answer on
Right.
that,
Yeah.
final answers are almost never given. You almost never have final answers. So uh, that's what I think. That's what many others think. That's a
Right.
widely held point of view. But
Okay.
besides what another mark against Wilson's theory is that many homosexuals over the years have married and had children. When I was a boy, I knew men who were
Right. Yeah.
homosexuals, who had families. Some of them didn't have children, but some of them did have children. So male homosexuals often do reproduce. That's all I can say about that. I
Right.
haven't done any
Yeah.
more work on it since I um, wrote about it in Human Nature and the Evolution of Society. People get tired of old ideas. I get tired of ideas really quickly. I want to move on to new stuff.
Right.
When I finish a book and people want to talk about that book, I'm much more interested in talking about the next
Next
book,
book.
the book
Right.
I'm starting to work on now. Levi Strauss, you're familiar with the anthropologist Claude
Right.
Levi Strauss.
Yeah.
He said He died recently, by the way, and he was 100 years old. I thought he
Didn't know
died
that.
long before, but a few
Yeah,
years
I thought
ago,
that.
he was 100. He was 100 years old when he died.
Right.
Um, uh, Lev Strauss said, "When I finish a book, it's dead to me. I no longer have any interest in it. I never look at it. I never read any of it again. I never look at it again. I'm finished with it. I'm on to the next work." I'm a bit like that. Not as extreme as Levi Strauss, uh, but I don't tend to go back and look at my books very much, um, unless I have a very specific reason to do so. Oh, what did I say? What exactly did I say about such and such? I may go back and look, but I don't tend to reread them. Or
Right. So I,
sometimes I pick a book off the shelf because I want to. I, I want to say exactly how did I say that, and then I look at it and thought, well, it's kind of interesting, and I reread a little bit of it. But sitting down and rereading, I've never sat down and reread an entire book
yeah,
or
right.
even half of it. I'm interested in the next book, but now I'm getting too old to have a next book.
Right.
That's
But
a
now I have to ask you about the next topic, which you discussed in your past. We will have to look back at your scientific career. For example, you use the split labor market theory
Oh
to
yes,
explain the origins of apartheid in South Africa, and
yes,
split labor market theory introduce the same assumptions of rational choice theory. For
yes,
example, this theory assumes that racial antagonisms are the result of the clashing interests of three social groups:
yes,
capitalists, higher paid labor, and cheap labor.
yes,
Totally contrary to the orthodox Marxist theory of
yes.
racial antagonism, which
It was
is some kind
developed
of
as
conspiracy theory, right?
yeah,
Okay.
it was developed as an alternative to the Marxist theory that um, capitalists conspire to hold
Divide and conquer
to
strategy.
promote racism and racial and hostility and antagonism to divide the working class by race and therefore keep the working class uh, from gaining too much power, holding wages down, and so forth and
Yeah.
so on.
Some kind of divide
Yeah,
and conquer strategy. Yeah.
yeah. What's that? The Marxist theory is divide and conquer. It's a divide and conquer theory.
Right.
Um, and I've debated when I wrote that. Well, it was one of my students who wrote a master's thesis. It was about 1985 or 1986. He was a South African student, a black South African student. And he came to me one day, I had never met him, and he said, I want to write a thesis on ethnobonus split labor market theory and how it applies to South Africa, and I would like you to supervise it. I said, great, great. And I did, and he wrote a really good thesis. It was an excellent thesis. Historical, he had to read a lot of historical literature. I had never read any of this literature. Um, so when he wrote a draft of his thesis, I said, well, now I haven't read the works you've read. So can I trust you? Can I trust you? How do I know your interpretations are good interpretations of what all of these people were in fact saying? Well, he he was a rather humble guy, and I don't remember exactly how he replied, but he may have said, "Well, I think I've done a pretty good job." So what I did is I went out and I got some of the works that he had cited, and I read pieces. You know, I read bits and pieces of them, and
Right.
what I found was that he'd done a very good job. He was very accurate. He had done a very good job of interpreting what these people were saying. So I trusted him, and he finished the thesis, and then we wrote together the article that you're referring to.
Right.
Well, The theory was formulated by Edna Bonisich. She was one of my colleagues also at the University of California, Riverside, although when I went there was basically her last year. I knew her a little and I've had some contact with her. She's given up. She abandoned the theory. She now says it's no good.
Really?
Yeah, because she's a radical Marxist. She's a social activist and she's a radical Marxist. She's become more radical over the years. And she's now switched over to some version of some type of Marxist theory. I don't really know exactly what her thinking is now, but she's abandoned her own theory. Said this happened, but she's abandoned it for political reasons, not for scientific reasons.
Right.
I think it's a fairly good theory, but it's a much more limited theory than I had imagined when my student wrote his thesis. We called the article "Racial Antagonism and the Origins of Apartheid in South Africa."
Right.
A split labor market analysis. The problem with the article is that it doesn't really explain apartheid in South Africa. The development of apartheid in South Africa has to be traced to the severe threat posed by the very large African population to the relatively small white population. The white population being about 20% of the population, the black population maybe 70%, and then there were East Indians who were entrepreneurs in South Africa. There was a class of so-called coloreds. They were mixed race. But at any rate, when you're faced with a huge population that's of a different race, and you're a small population, then the threat of the huge population is very great, and that's the primary thing that would have to be taken into account. The split labor market theory may be able to explain some of the things that happened in the gold mining industry, and that's what was being studied in the thesis and in the article. It probably does. The evidence suggests that there was a split labor market, and that was determining a lot of the behavior of the capitalists, gold miners, of the gold mining capitalists. But I would now limit it just to that. If you say we want to explain the behavior of gold mining capitalists from the 1880s up until, well, I think we dated it from 1886 to 1924. If that's what you're trying to explain, then the split labor market does a pretty good job. It also can explain some other instances of racial conflict or racial antagonism. There's a sociologist, a young sociologist who subsequently died fairly young. He applied it to the relations between whites and Chinese laborers in the United States in, I think, the late 19th century. There was a lot of importation of Chinese and Japanese labor into the United States in the second half of the 19th century to work on the railroads. The railroads were expanding, and they needed labor. They needed more labor than they had. And so they imported a lot of Chinese and a lot of Japanese, who then became threats to white workers. You've got Japanese workers, you've got Chinese workers, you've got Asian workers, and at that time they were very different culturally. They were very, very different culturally from what they are now. They've rather thoroughly assimilated into American society, but 100, 150 years ago they had not. And so there was a lot of racial conflict between the two. And so split labor market theory may work well for for that particular conflict, and there have been attempts to apply it to some other instances of racial or ethnic conflict, but I don't think it's works as a general explanation. Much more is going on uh, in racial conflict and than just split labor market.
Right.
You've got racial antagonism everywhere in the world. You've got
Yeah.
it all over the place. It's one of the most common things, ethnic and racial antagonism. It's one of the most common forms of human behavior, and most of it exists outside the context of any kind of split labor market. So in 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 our work on that, mainly in my students' work, I just polished it up a little bit, and I wrote the article. Um, we went too far. We got in over our heads. We were trying to explain too much with it. So I thought it could be a general theory of racial conflict, and it's fact just a specialized theory that can explain some instances of racial conflict, but not racial conflict in general. That's a much tougher problem that requires other kinds of theoretical ideas to
Right.
understand.
And also, you wrote about another very interesting thing, which is your general theory of capitalism.
Oh, yes.
In that article, you wrote that all the major theories of the capitalist transition, Marxist, Weberian, world system theories, are deficient in some
Yes.
way or another because they all ignored the other great instance of the emergence of capitalism, which is the Japanese case, because the medieval Japan was very similar to European feudalism, and it seems that also the medieval Japan underwent similar historical transition to capitalism like Europe also went.
Yeah. You know, that's one of my best articles. I think is one of my very best articles.
I agree.
You
really,
also
really, it's amazing.
very good, very good.
I think you're the only sociologist in the world who tried to develop the general theory of capitalism. I don't know any other
I might be.
sociologist who tried to develop.
Years ago, I published that article in 1994. And quite a few years before that, maybe 10 years before that, I had begun to notice similarities in between Japan and Western Europe in the development of capitalism. And at some point, I began to sit down and try to think it through more and write down some of the similarities. I came up with 5, I think. I missed one, which I'll mention in a minute. But I published it in Emanuel Wallerstein's journal review. I submitted it to that journal. He liked it very much. They accepted it right away. They just wanted me to make it a little bit shorter. That's all I had to do. It was a bit too long for. The longer the article, the more expensive it is to publish it, and the less space they have for other articles and so on. A sociologist I mentioned earlier, Randall Collins, you should interview him. You should interview Randall.
I have him in mind also, yeah.
What's that?
I have him in my mind to interview
Definitely interview him. He's a very nice man. He'll give you a very good interview. In my opinion, he's the best sociological theorist in the world today. I don't agree with many of his ideas. His older Weberian ideas, I think, are quite good. His newer ideas are very Durkheimian, and I don't think they're very good. But he would be a very good subject for an interview. I sent it to him, and he really liked it, and he tried to recruit it for another journal. And I said, well, I've already submitted it to Wallerstein's journal, and I'm waiting for a decision. Oh, he said, if you've submitted it there, then if he accepts it, then by all means publish it there. So I did. Then, a few years later, he wrote when I sent it to him and he read it, he said, it's very interesting. You've got a lot of good ideas here, but are they enough to explain Japanese capitalism? Well, of course, if he's saying that, the answer will be no, it's not enough. So he came up with another idea, which I think is a very foolish, very wrong-headed idea, that it was Buddhism. This is a Weberian idea.
Right, yeah, yeah.
It's actually a sort of an anti-Weberian idea because Weber argued that religions like Buddhism were not at all favorable to the development of capitalism. It was Protestantism, and particularly Calvinism, and
right.
In the West that
Buddhism is too passive.
Pardon?
Like the Buddhism is too passive,
too passive, and
right.
The Buddhists want to withdraw from the world, not have a big impact on the world, and they withdraw into their monasteries and they contemplate and they meditate and so forth and so on. So this was Weber's thinking. Well, he came out and he published an article in the American Sociological Review on the role of Buddhism in the development of Japanese capitalism, an article that I think was totally wrong, just totally wrong and misguided. Did he cite my article that I had by then published in Wallerstein's journal? Once, in one sentence, critically. What I would have done in writing such an article, I would have said, Sanderson has recently provided a theory which identifies some of the important factors. And you could devote a couple of 1 or 2 paragraphs to summarizing the basic argument of my article. You don't have to say too much about it, just the basic arguments succinctly summarized. He didn't say a thing. He just cited me in a footnote in a critical way. So what is going on? I was terribly disappointed. Here's what's going on. What's going on is the question of originality. I don't want to give Sanderson any credit. He is a potential, he's a potential competitor. He's got a materialist theory. And that doesn't give any emphasis to religion at all. And so I want to have my own original theory, and I want to have it be a kind of neo-Weberian or even non-Weberian theory that takes Weber and turns him on his head. But I don't write that way. See, this is not the way I approach things. By the way, it's not the way Emanuel Wallerstein approaches things. What I try to do is I try to look at a field of study or a question, a big question, and I look at what other people have been saying. All right, this person and this person and this person have been studying the rise of capitalism in Japan. Very few people have done that, but we can go back and we can look at some who have, and then I will summarize what they've said, and then I will offer some kind of criticism that they're either wrong or there's an important neglected factor, or maybe more than one neglected factor, and then I would go ahead to present my own theory. But that's not what he did. He's a big name. He's much more famous than I am. He's a world-renowned, world-famous guy. So why give me very much credit? Why not take all the credit for himself? But see, this is what goes on in the academic world. Constant competition, often severe conflict and severe conflict. Collins actually said once, and it's a great comment, he used to study the sociology of science. He wrote some interesting articles on science. And I think it's in his book, Conflict Sociology. He said if science were described accurately, it would be an open field in which the scientists stood, each one saying, listen to me, listen to me. You've got competitors. That's a Darwinian view of science.
Right.
It's a struggle for scientific recognition. It's not you're reproducing not genes but ideas. You're perpetuating your ideas to the fullest extent you can. You want to become a dominant figure. You want to become not a dominant male produces offspring. Why you really do produce intellectual offspring.
Right.
The best situation is to have students who will perpetuate your ideas, although some of them later on may start turning against your ideas. This happens. But if you don't have students, this is a problem. The great scholars, most of them, they have students who can help them develop their idea and who can carry them on into the next gen.
Right. Yeah. I think I remember that article he wrote about that. I think it's called Sociology, a pro-science or anti-science, where he mentioned that thing about the competition of the.
I thought he had said this in the chapter on science in his book Conflict Sociology, but you could be right. I get
sorry. Yeah, you're right. But I think I also saw that in that
article. He may say it there too.
Yeah.
You can present the same idea in many publications. And the more publications you put it in, the more people are going to hear about it.
Right.
But that's exactly right. It's the scientific competition. It's the struggle for prestige. It's the struggle for status. Many scientists would rather be well known and prestigious than be right. Truly, this is absolutely the case. That's why people cling to their idea. If you're constantly giving ideas up, then people say, well, this guy, who is he? He keeps changing from one idea. He has an idea, then he throws it away. Now he has another idea, and he throws that away. Well, you're going to look bad if you keep doing that. Emanuel Wallerstein has the bad habit of rejecting some of his older ideas, but never telling you he's rejecting them. He could say, and I've said, I got this wrong, and now I would say, I said X before, didn't get that quite right. Now I would say Y. But I believe in being honest and open. All of us get things wrong, but many people won't admit it. It makes them look bad, or they feel their status level drops. But he has this conflict perspective on science, which is excellent. I took the title, you see, the name of my theory from him, conflict theory.
Yeah.
And I've gotten to know him pretty well, and I've had lots of conversations with him, mostly originally by letter before we had email, and then later by email. And I said, I have this theory, and I sent it to him, a very early version of it. I was originally going to call it by a very poor name, synthetic materialism, a synthesizer of biological material, a synthesis of biological materialism and economic or techno-economic materialism, the culture material of Marvin Harris. But I didn't think that name was a very catchy one. I said, should I call it that? Or another possibility is Darwinian conflict theory. Always said, use the Darwinian conflict theory, that's better. And I was leaning in that direction anyhow, but I just ran this idea by him. And he's in the theory. I mean, he's in my theory. I've got him in the section on stratification and status and wealth. He came up with this idea of emotional energy. Do you recall that idea?
Yeah, I know about it.
People get emotional energy from certain kinds of interactions. And when they have
Interaction
other
risk,
kinds of interactions, their emotional energy drops. I said, well, that fits perfectly into my more Darwinian perspective. When people rise in status, they gain emotional energy.
right.
When they go to, if they go to a conference and they give a paper and people come up and say, oh, that was a really nice paper and you've contributed some very important ideas there and I want to try to develop some of your ideas. Boom, you feel great, you're energized, your emotional energy rises. Or you go to the conference and you give your paper and everyone criticizes it. You know, there's a fierce attack on your I saw this once with Collins, and he was shaken by it. I watched him. It was an analysis of one of his books by another well-known theorist, and he said some pretty unkind things. Well, he said, Collins hasn't really thought that idea through. Oh, that's a very critical thing. When you're a famous theorist and you're accused of not having thought carefully enough about your idea, that's a stinging criticism. And you could see that it really stung Collins. And so at the end, when all the papers had been presented, the moderator asked, would the presenters like to respond? And Collins shook his head. No, he did not wish to respond. And the look on his face was a man who had had a serious drop of emotional
energy. Yeah.
Which you, of course, you would expect. He told me once, I sent him one of my course syllabi, and in the syllabus I said, I love controversy. So if you want to ask questions, ask questions. And, giving out the first day of class. If you have questions, ask them. If you want to criticize some of the things I'm saying, and you have a good reasons for being critical, by all means, make critical comments, and we can have some kind of debate and so forth and so on. And I try to, in my teaching, I try to stir up controversy and so on. Well, he wrote back and he said, I don't like controversy. I stay away from it. And he does. He does. He stays away. He likes agreement. He likes consensus, especially if he's presenting ideas to people who are on his same status level or perhaps a higher status level. Oh, he stays away from criticizing them. He's afraid to criticize them. In fact, but the emotional energy fits perfectly into my Darwinian conflict theory. I have it in there in several of the propositions. He labeled it EE, capital E, capital E. Well, I doubt that he's ever read my. Oh, he may have. He wouldn't like it very much because it's Darwinian. It's got the biological stuff in it, and he doesn't like that. He strongly encouraged me not to publish that. It was in my book, The Evolution of Human Sociology, when I was finishing it. Don't publish that book, he said. Don't publish that book. There will be severe hostility directed toward you. So he doesn't like that. But guess what? I published the book. There's no hostility whatsoever. It was totally ignored. This is the worst thing that can happen to you, being ignored. By the sociologists, they ignored it. I never heard a single comment from a sociologist on that book. Who paid attention to it? The anthropologists paid attention to it because they're much more predisposed toward Darwinian thinking. It was the anthropologists and the psychologists who, working together, created evolutionary psychology. They're much more receptive. So my book has been read much more. That book has been read much more by anthropologists. And the anthropologists are much more receptive to it. As far as I know, I know of one sociologist who's written. Maybe there may be a couple, and they've liked it, but they were predisposed toward these kinds of ideas. But most sociologists would just ignore it. They wouldn't even read it. They'd see the subtitle, A Darwinian Conflict Perspective. I don't bother with that. Why would I bother with that? So there wasn't any hostility. It was just totally ignored. Because hostility is better. Then people are paying attention. Then you can get into some debate. And I'm like everybody else. You get name recognition. You get status in the sense that people know who you are,
Yeah.
and you get into other people's conversations. Uh, at a meeting of the American Sociological Association, I was walking down the hall and there was a session going on and a woman was talking and I heard my name mentioned.
Really?
She was a theoretician because I'd written in a newsletter article severely criticizing the state of sociological theory in the
Yeah.
journals and so on, and she was really giving it to me. Wow, this is the kind of thing Stephen Sanderson would say, but this is wrong. And blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I like that. It's good. See, she's paying somebody.
Yeah.
I knew she was, but we never met. And so she's paying attention. See, she's taking the trouble to criticize it.
Right. Yeah.
If no one bothers to criticize it, then they either agree with it or they don't
Right.
take it seriously. So if she's criticizing it, then it's a bit of a threat. And so she has to come out and say bad things. I'd rather they say bad things than say nothing at all. Unless they say, well, he's an extremely stupid person. I don't know how anybody would ever publish this art. If they say something like that, well, you don't want to hear that. But you want them to engage with the argument you're making. And she was the kind of person who, of course, wouldn't have liked what I said. She would be very hostile to what I said.
Yeah.
But she's taking the time to criticize it. That means you're getting
That's
you're
important.
getting under people's skin. They're paying attention to what you said.
Yeah, I agree.
Jonathan Turner read that article. You're going to interview him, right?
Right. Yeah.
You said you would interview Turner. He loved it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Right.
It's a fantastic article because it was the kind of thing he agreed with. I even cited him in the article and then in a very favorable way. He loved, oh, that's true. This is great stuff. But he and I think somewhat along the same lines in regard to how we should do theory, how theory should be built and so on. He'll be a tough interview. He's a tough guy.
I've done the interview with Jonathan Turner. It's on the channel. He's the first person I interviewed.
Oh, you interviewed him already?
Really? Yeah.
And you said I was going to be the first.
But
I don't care.
I know, but yeah, he replied first. Yeah, I invited you and him at the same time, but
I see. And he
was available.
Yeah.
Before, yeah, and also he mentioned in the interview your work, like that you and him have some kind of fundamental disagreement about the notion of the human nature. Like you are more prone to the sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, and he don't think that human nature is in that sense like sociologists and evolutionary psychologists says that human nature.
Right. No, you're quite right. Yeah, he and I we have a major conflict over that. And his notion of human nature it's a very thin notion of human nature. It's very weak. It's very thin. He doesn't like evolutionary psychology. He's very critical of it, but the things he says are wrong. He says evolutionary psychology is nothing but a bunch of just so stories for which there's no evidence. I said, John, there are some just so stories in evolutionary psychology, but most of the theories are not just so stories, and there is a great deal of evidence. The problem, I said, is you don't read the journals where the evidence is presented. It's not presented in any sociological journals. He doesn't even read any journals, as far as I know, from things he said. I don't think he reads he doesn't read many of the journals. But he's not going to encounter the evidence in the sociological journals. You have to go to the specialized journals, Evolution and Human Behavior, Human Nature, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, a journal just called Evolutionary Psychology, another one called Evolutionary Psychological Science or something like that. There's one called Evolutionary Anthropology. Let's read these journals. I'm fairly sure he doesn't even know they exist. Well, then, if you want to find evidence, you have to go read those journals. I've been reading them for 20 years. Not everyone, and not all the articles in them, but that's where you find the evidence.
Yeah.
And in some of the specialized books. And I've read all this stuff, and I said, John, there's a great deal of evidence. He has a personal prejudice. It is a purely personal prejudice, and nothing more than a. Don't tell him you've interviewed him. He has nothing more than a personal prejudice. It is not a scientific or theoretical critique. It is a purely personal dislike. And people have these things. Some people don't like certain ideas. They just don't like them. They don't have any strong reason. They just have a personal prejudice. It just doesn't fit their brain somehow. And this doesn't fit his brain. And it doesn't fit most sociological brains. And he's, of course, trained as a sociologist. He is a sociologist. So he wouldn't like evolutionary psychology. But he and his wife, Sandy Mariansky, she started out in anthropology. She's really a primatologist.
Right.
And so he uses ideas that she's developed. And they spend a lot of time talking about apes, about primates.
Jonathan, I'm sorry for interrupting you. For example, I know that Jonathan says, for example, the basic assumptions of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology are wrong because they are more a result of the evolved patterns of social organization and their cultures. Then they are the result of the natural selection working on biological genotype. For example, I know that in his last book on human nature, he said like that human nature, we people at our biological core are what we inherited from the less common ancestors we share with the other great apes, like weak social ties.
Yes.
We are not social animals, and we are not prone to nor aggression, nor hierarchies, nor to like nuclear family, for example.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the idea is that, I'm sure he mentioned this, humans started out as individualistic apes. And they had to learn to become highly social. When they came out of the forest into the open savanna, there were all these predators, and they had to defend themselves against predators, and they had to get socially organized in order to do that. And
so natural selection worked on our brains in order to enhance emotionality.
And it created strong emotional ties. There's a subfield called sociology of emotions, and he's done a lot of work in that, and so this plays a big role. The latest book they've written is on religion from a natural selectionist point of view, but there's no natural selection in it. No. There's absolutely no natural selection in it. He's just playing off that Darwinian concept, you see, but it's not really about that. It is a little bit sort of, there was a natural selection for emotions and so forth and so on, but that's about it. And humans are they had to learn to develop these strong emotional ties. And religion gets this idea, they get this idea from Durkheim's book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, that religion promoted group solidarity. It promoted strong emotions. You get emotional effervescence and all this stuff comes out of Durkheim, see, and they've adopted that, and they're going in the wrong direction. It looked like they were moving toward a more biological view, more similar to sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. It looked like it, but maybe it just looked like it. But at any rate, in the last 10 or 15, 20 years, they've sort of gone off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, like they've abandoned the adaptionist position, and also he abandoned the byproduct position, like that the natural selection has nothing to do with the religion. I think that's his position.
Right. And so I wrote this book. You're familiar with the Religious Evolution in the Axial Age? Do you know that book? It's a new book, and it's the last book I published. A couple of years ago it came out.
I didn't read it.
It came out 6 months after their book came out. Right. And there's an Italian guy who's reviewed both books. He wrote a review essay of both books, comparing them.
Really?
Then he invited all of us to reply. And he said ridiculous things about my book. And he said ridiculous things about the Turner book. Turner and Mariansky, and then the two Danish students of religion. And he completely misinterprets their book. They must have been I haven't seen their reply. Yeah. Replies are being published in a few months. They just sent me the page proofs yesterday. In fact, I have to look them over. But he really distorts the Turner book. They must have been furious because he makes their book sound more like my book. Oh, well, they don't want their book to sound more like my book because they hate the ideas in my book. He spent 30 minutes in a seminar criticizing me in my book. You've gone into a blind alley. These are totally ridiculous ideas. And this is awful what you're doing, and so forth and so on. He went on. This was in a departmental seminar at Riverside with about a whole bunch of graduate students, a whole bunch of faculty there. He went on for 30 minutes nonstop like this. Then we walked back to the department together, and he spoke for another 30 minutes against everything I was saying. So he hates that kind of stuff. He hates it, and but it's a personal prejudice. It's a personal prejudice. But in the book in this book that I showed you, he criticizes the book. He criticizes his own book.
That's ridiculous.
Can you believe it? He has a few sentences in there in which he's more or less saying this book should never have been written. Not quite that extreme, but something like that. He says, toward an evolutionary social science. And in the book, he warns sociologists against an evolutionary social science. What kind of person criticizes the whole logic of the book that he's putting together? I couldn't believe it. I saw that, and he's got in this book and in another handbook that came out a couple of years after this, he's got a couple of articles, one of which is on the limitations of evolutionary psychology for a theory of human behavior. And he doesn't have a single criticism. You read the article, and there's not a single criticism. You read it and you went, well, where was the criticism? Where was it? He just goes off in some direction and that has almost nothing to do with, I can't remember that he mentioned a single criticism.
All right.
So see, they think they're doing biological stuff, but they're not. Their work with the evolutionary psychologists would look at their work and say, what is this? Is this what the sociologists are doing? if this is what they're doing, we don't want to talk to them.
Right.
You know, Tooby and Cosmides were the founders of evolutionary psychology. Oh, they hate Tooby and Cosmides. You don't have anything good to say about Tooby and Cosmides, although their ideas are much,
Adapted mind. Yeah.
much. Yeah, exactly. The adapted mind. No. Tooby and Cosmides stick through their heart. But mostly it's been friendly. You know,
Yeah.
you know,
He's a
John
kind
is
person.
extremely critical. He will tear you to pieces. If he gets someone that he has a severe disagreement with,
Right.
he'll tear them to pieces. One of our graduate students said he spent 4 hours in his office telling me everything was wrong with my thinking.
Really?
If he goes on for 4 hours, there must be a lot of things wrong with your thinking. But that's the way he's extremely critical. If he doesn't like something, he tears it apart.
Okay. So
That's enough. But let me remain on very frank.
it's
This is part of intellectual criticism.
right.
It's fine. So this is the way intellectual life is. It's full of criticism. It's full of conflict, and this is normal. And it often gets really mean and nasty. You even get death threats, and believe it or not.
Really?
Oh yes, John and Edna Bonisich, when she was in the department, they hated each other. Randy Collins was chair of the department, and he told me, Edna and John just would sit in faculty meetings and curse at each other, swear at each other. John claims Edna called him in the middle of the night and threatened to kill him. That's what he said. Now, I rather doubt, but Edna was a very mean woman. I heard her. I heard her criticize some people, and it was just mean, really mean and nasty. The worst I've ever seen, actually. So it can get mean and it can get nasty. And then the bonus said she got mean and nasty, and John, with someone like her, he would really go after her. She was on the activist side of the department. There are two sides of the department: the political activists and the more research-oriented, more
theoretical,
scientific.
They
hated each other. The sides were constantly battling and cursing each other out and fighting with each other, and the department was almost shut down because of it. And then they solved their problems, and 5 years later they reemerged. So I'm telling you behind the scenes stuff. You see, I'm telling you the dirt that you wouldn't hear from others. This is normal.
Right. I agree totally.
John's criticism didn't bother me. I was a bit disappointed that he was so unreceptive to some of these ideas, but I wasn't personally insulted. Because I would have been 40 years ago or 50 when I was just starting out. I would have been terribly upset. But I've seen this happen so many times, and I've had so many criticisms thrown at me that you develop a tough skin. You see, if you don't, you're dead. You have to drop out of the field because you would be constantly miserable. This is normal. This is the way things work. And if you can't take that, you better go do something else.
Right.
Now, what's the next topic?
Yeah, the last topic. Yeah, it's your critical assessment of the world system theory. And I'm referring to the debate you had with Christopher Chase Dunn.
Right.
In general, you pointed out some major problems which world system theory has, like their Marxist baggage and misinterpretation of the effects of the foreign investment on the periphery and stuff like that. Can you
those are some of the, yeah, those are
some
some
of
of the
them.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some of the things I said. I think that's one of my best articles.
After the general theory of capitalism.
Yeah. If we go back 30 years, if we go back about 33 years, when I wrote my first book, Macro Sociology, it was my first book, and it was published in 1988. I was an advocate of world systems theory. I was convinced by it. I was in my more left-wing phase then, and I had read Wallerstein's first volume of his great book, The Modern World System, and wow, this is a tremendously impressive book, and it was a work of outstanding scholarship. Although I knew it was being severely criticized by others. What began to happen, and I'm not quite sure when it began to happen, maybe about early 1990s, 1995, I began to notice certain things that were happening in the modern world. And one of the main things that I saw is that the less developed societies were developing a lot more than I would have expected based on what world systems theory and the closely related theory, dependency theory. The dependency theory really came first, and I think Wallerstein was greatly influenced by Andre Gunderfrank and who's one of the fathers of dependency theory. I began to notice for each revision of, that book went through 4 editions. And for each revision, I had to go back and I had to look at new data. I had to update my data. And as I began to look at the data over time, I thought, there's a lot of development going on in these societies. And in a few cases, there's a lot of development. Some societies are stagnating, particularly in Africa and in a few other parts of the world. But on the whole, there's a lot of development going on in the so-called third world or less developed world, and a lot more than I would have anticipated based on the predictions of world systems theory. And so I gradually began to be skeptical. I began to be somewhat more skeptical and somewhat more critical. And what was the other thing that there was as I've gotten older, my memory is not quite as good. Right. This happens.
Yeah, it's natural.
What is your age?
28.
Yeah, I was going to say 30, so I was pretty close. My memory was really good at 28, but I'm 75 now, and for the last 10 or 15 years, it's not so good. I walk into the next room to get something. Once I get into the next room, I've forgotten what it is I went in there to get.
It happens to me now.
5 seconds to walk into the room, and in 5 seconds I forgot. Then I come back. Then I remember. Then I go back again, and I've forgotten again. It's unbelievable. These things start to happen as you get into your later years. But in about 1992, I think it was, a sociologist at Penn State by the name of Glenn Firebaugh published a tremendously important article saying that the dependency and world system theorists were wrong. They've misinterpreted their data. And he gave a complex methodological argument. I couldn't follow the methodology, the statistical part of it, because this is not one of my strengths.
Or mine.
Yeah. And I was sitting having dinner with Chase Dunn and some other world system people. I think it was at ASA meetings here in Pittsburgh in 1992. Oh, this article has come out in the AJS and he's saying blah, 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 blah. Ooh, we're going to have to respond to that. And they tried to respond to it and they failed totally. They failed totally. They couldn't. They wrote a critique and it was absurd. No self-respecting journal would have published that, and of course it was obviously rejected. A lot of wild ranting and raving. I began to study Farbaugh's article, and that came at the time I was beginning to be more skeptical of dependency in world system theory. So they sort of converged and stimulated my thinking, and my thinking started developing faster and faster. What Farbaugh said basically, and break it down to just one big idea.
Right.
It had to do with, it was all about the role of foreign investment in, the world system. You were saying foreign investment inhibits economic development. Foreign investment should get out. And if, the foreign capitalists are causing the underdevelopment of the countries, and they can only develop if foreign investors get out.
Yeah.
See, so they're blaming Western capitalism for the problems of the less developed world. What Farbaugh said is this: domestic development, domestic investment, take an example in say Argentina in Latin America, which has undergone quite a bit of development in recent decades. If you're in Argentina, investment in the country by other Argentines, by Argentinian capitalists, is better than foreign investment. It produces more growth than foreign investment, but foreign investment still produces growth. He had it all worked out statistically. So if you removed foreign investment, then you would slow the country's growth down. Domestic investment is better. So if you had, total domestic investment, maybe what I said a moment ago was not quite right, but if you could have 100% domestic investment, that would probably be better than having part domestic, part foreign. But he said, but foreign investment, even though it contributes less, it still contributes to growth. So foreign investment is not bad, it's good.
Right, like any exploitation is better than no exploitation. You wrote that.
An economist friend of mine quoted a famous economist, her name was Joan Robinson, and she said, according to him, better to be exploited by a capitalist than not to be exploited at all. Right. So the whole idea of exploitation in Marxian theory has to be rethought. What they would call exploitation, a lot of other people would not call exploitation. So they have a very poor, weak understanding of exploitation. And you raise the question, are capitalists really exploiting people? Well, if we look at the last 100 years of the United States, there's been enormous economic development in the United States in the last 100 years. And the condition of the working class in the United States is vastly improved in 2020 compared to what it was in 1920. Even as a boy growing up in the 1950s, the standard of living today, 70 years later, 60 or 70 years later, is much higher than it was when I was a boy in the 1950s, when I was a young boy. We're way ahead of where we were then. People have all kinds of things now that weren't available then. People have, ordinary people have fancy cameras. They have expensive, very fancy cameras that they can do all kinds of sophisticated things with. I can tell you, that in, say, 1955, anybody with a camera like that, or the most advanced camera available at the time, would be rich. And the vast majority of people would never have been able to afford anything like that. It would have been unthinkable that my father and mother would have ever thought of buying a camera like that. They used a little simple camera called a Brownie. It was sort of the basic camera of the day. And they took pictures with this little Brownie, an inexpensive little camera. Most people had Brownies. They couldn't afford these expensive cameras. Now, many people have had these expensive cameras. And they have all kinds of other things. And, the cars that people drive today are enormously more luxurious and than they were earlier. In the 50s, driving your car, it was common to have a flat tire. Then you'd have to get out and pump up your car and take the old tire off, put the new tire on, and so forth. I haven't had a flat tire in 25 years. That's because the tires are so good now. So the driving experience is much easier now. It's much nicer, more comfortable than it was all those years ago because of technological and economic improvement. And that's only in the last 70 years. Go back another 50 years to 1920, when most people still didn't have cars at all. Okay. So there's been, and even in the less developed countries, if you looked at Argentina in 1920 compared to Argentina in 2020, you would see an enormous amount of economic development. And yet, there's been an enormous amount of foreign investment in that country. So I began to notice all these things, and over time, I began to see this stuff may not be right. It may not be right. Then I began to realize that, unfortunately, I had accepted these arguments not on the basis of good scientific evidence, because they never, well, Chase Dunn and a few other people back in the 70s, they wrote some articles on dependency and world system theory, claiming to have demonstrated empirically, scientifically, that dependency and world system theory were right. But then Firebaugh came along and said, no, they did it all wrong. They didn't do it right statistically. And Firebaugh is one of the giants. He's one of the giants. He's a distinguished professor. He holds the rank of distinguished professor at Penn State. He's one of the giants, and he knows much more than they do about this kind of statistical analysis. They did it all wrong. They didn't understand. They didn't even understand their own results. And so I gradually dropped dependency on world system theory and came to realize that no, it's wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah. Also, they can't explain the sub-Saharan situation.
The what situation?
African situation.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Best case.
They can't explain that.
Like, they say that awful conditions in Africa are due to foreign investments, but if you look at the scientific data, there are no foreign investments in Africa.
There's little foreign investment.
1% of the world.
It's like 1 or 2%, because they don't have a highly educated workforce. They don't have a population that is capable of buying much of anything. So why invest there?
Right.
So they've gone in and they've tried to do mining and things like that, and exploit some of the natural resources. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it was only colonized for about 70 or 80 years. Latin America was colonized for something like 250 to 300 years, and it's way ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. So if it's colonialism and foreign economic domination, then Africa should be way ahead of Latin America, but the opposite is the case. Once colonialism ended in sub-Saharan Africa in the 50s, it's gone downhill. It's much worse off today in many respects than it was when it was under colonial control. Now, some things have improved, but they've improved because of the colonialism. Medical care has improved.
Right.
Medical care is much better. So there's better medical care, there's better health. Infant mortality has dropped dramatically, but it was the Western colonists, the Brits and the French and the Belgians and mostly the British and the French, they introduced all this stuff. In India, they introduced a modern legal and political system. So India became one of the few democracies of the less developed world. They introduced a mass educational system, which was very advantageous for the Indians. The Indians would go to the British schools and they would learn English right away. Well, knowing English, if you're in India and you know English, that's a tremendous advantage. And you can deal with other countries where they're speaking English and so on. Of course, India still has its big problems, but eventually it's starting to make serious progress. But sub-Saharan Africa has gotten worse, and dependency and world system theory have absolutely no chance whatsoever of explaining sub-Saharan Africa. Colonialism was short. Things have gotten worse since colonialism. It's a catastrophe in sub-Saharan.
Right.
The colonists said they cannot rule themselves. They cannot implement modern systems of government that will be effective. And that's exactly what happened. Most African countries are ruled by brutal dictators who fleece the country, who exploit the masses, who steal. They have what an African scholar calls vampire states. They're vampire states. And he said this is a serious problem in Africa, and it is. Well, but the colonists put down parliamentary forms of government that the Africans haven't been able, for one reason or another, to maintain. And Andre Gunderfrank says, well, in Africa, the lemon was squeezed dry and then it was thrown away. No, Africa was better off under the colonists than it is now. Now, the colonists did bad things. They were racist, and they looked down upon the indigenous population as inferior and so forth and so on. So there were certainly a lot of negative things that the colonists did, and that the indigenous populations resented, which is why they developed anti-colonialist movements and so on. But world system theory can't even come close to explaining Africa. And yet it was Emanuel Wallerstein himself who, upon his first interest was Africa, was colonialism in Africa. And when he went to Africa, he said, well, what's wrong with Africa is foreign economic domination. That's what's wrong. And yet that's completely wrong. Completely wrong. You can't explain Africa at all.
Yeah.
So I wrote this long article in, the International Journal of Comparative Sociology. And Chase Dunn, you're going to interview him, right?
Maybe.
He's an interesting guy. He'll give you a very lively interview. He'll talk. He may mention me too. We're old friends. We've known each other for about 35 years.
Right. Yeah, I know that.
We know each other very well. Very, very well. He'll probably say some things about me, probably critical.
Right.
He doesn't like it that I moved away from world system independence. When I wrote my article, published in 2006, I think it was, he said to me, that's the best critique anybody has ever written of world system theory. And he said, the reason is because you understand world system theory. That critique was written by a person who understands what he's criticizing. All the other critiques are written by people who don't understand world system theory. But I always feel that if you're going to criticize something, you have to understand it.
Send it.
You have
Yeah.
to read it and absorb its ideas. And then if you feel the need for criticism, then write your critique. But many people, they don't read it, or they just hear about some of its ideas, or they read a little bit of it, not very much.
Right.
And then they write criticisms based on all kinds of misconceptions and misunderstandings. I've read reviews of my books that look like the people can possibly have read the book. They have me saying things that I never said or never
Right.
would say. Chris Chase Dunn has a good line. Anybody can criticize a book if they've read it.
Right.
Anybody can write a critique of a book if they've read it.
First thing first.
I organized a session on world system theory in 1992, ASA meetings right here in Pittsburgh.
Right.
And it was on Chase Dunn's book, Global Formation, which was a big comprehensive work on world system theory. So I was still into it. It was an author meets critic session, and there were three critics: Randall Collins, Charles Tilley, and Emmanuel Wallerstein. Chase Dunn was furious with what Wallerstein had said. He didn't read my book. He read the first chapter and he read the last chapter. That's all he read. He was furious. He was absolutely furious. You don't want to get him mad. He's a very nice guy, really. He's a very nice guy and very smart guy.
Right.
Very, very smart guy. And an extremely hard worker. He works constantly. But he won't give up on these ideas.
Right.
He won't give up on these ideas.
And,
I've hardly convinced him of anything.
Right.
But this is the way it usually goes.
Yeah.
You criticize people, but they don't give their ideas up. You just don't see much of that. I've done it more than almost anybody. But see, my commitment is to the truth. If I held a viewpoint, and then over the years I began to see new evidence accumulate, which was what was happening in the case of dependency on world system theory, I was beginning to see all kinds of evidence that didn't fit.
Right.
And at a certain point, I had to say, there's just too much evidence against it to be able to maintain it. And so...
value-free sociology, value-free.
Yeah. And, you know, who was it who said, I think it was Marvin Harris who said, objectivity is honesty in face of the facts. You look the facts in the eye and you say,
Right.
Now, of course, the facts may not be facts. They may be false. So you have to judge and evaluate. But as I judged and evaluated all the new evidence that I was accumulating, I gradually gave up world system theory, and I gradually came to realize that split labor market theory was much more limited use than I thought. And if you're going to explain the origins of apartheid, you'd have to have much bigger, more comprehensive ideas than just little split labor market theory and so forth and so on. But it takes time to develop ideas. You know, for most of us, some people are geniuses and they get them right away. But even Einstein,
right.
You take one of the great geniuses of all time, he struggled mightily to develop things. He had his special theory of relativity in 1905, and took him 10 years to extend it to the general theory. 10 years. And this was Einstein, with all kinds of problems and false start in between. He got many things wrong. Everybody gets many things wrong. It's just a question of whether they have the courage to admit it.
Admit that, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, people become personally involved in their ideas. They feel that they are their ideas. They can't separate themselves from their ideas. If they would abandon their ideas, it would be a horrible loss of self-esteem.
Right, yeah.
and most people just can't do it. They are their ideas. People sometimes say, I'm going to make a criticism of what you said, but don't take this personally. They always take it personally because your ideas are part of you. Like your arm is part of you. Your ideas are part of you. Yeah. They belong to you. You created them. It's just like they're your intellectual children. And so if people criticize your children and you love your children, you don't like that too much, right? And you will defend your children. Well, your ideas are your intellectual children. You created them.
Right, like the very ideological prospects for the future of the socialism that world system theorists have. For example, like there is going to be some, like you said, universal global government that would give up on the power and the domination. Like, it's very ideological.
This is another world system idea, in particular Chase Dunn idea, which is totally wrong-headed. I've said to him, a world state would be so powerful that it would become a totalitarian government ruling the whole world, suffocating freedom and suffocating economic development. It would be a horrible, it sounds good when you just talk about it, but in reality, it would be a horror. It would be the Soviet Union or China at a world scale, at a world level, with no opposition.
First time strategy and second.
With no enemies, no opposition. What would it do? What would it do? Well, it would do what China is now doing. You know, I'm sure some of the people who reported on the COVID virus early on, they were taken away, never to be seen again. Many of them, I'm sure, were shot. That's what those governments do. They shoot you, or they take you away and isolate you, never to be heard from again, or they just shoot you. So do we want a world state which will shoot people for expressing their ideas? I don't want one. He thinks it will be, Chase Dunn is under the illusion that it will be democratic. But the analysis of states and the behavior of states throughout all of world history suggests otherwise. But it's an idea. He's so committed to this idea, he can't give it up. He just can't give it up. He won't give it up. He's 77 years old now. He just had his 77th birthday last month. Well, he'll probably live to about 90. Right. He's in excellent physical condition, and his mind is still very, very, very sharp. He's still publishing a lot of things. I'm surprised at how much he can still do. But he'll go to his grave still hoping for what he calls a democratically rational global commonwealth. It will be neither democratic nor global, nor a commonwealth for that matter. It will be a brutal dictatorial state. Might not start out that way, but it will certainly
eventually lead to that.
Yeah, it will lead to that. Now, all the evidence shows that. Weber criticized Marx, saying, look, if you get a socialist society along the lines the Marxists want, the state will not. Marx talked about the withering away of the state. Weber said the state won't wither away, it will grow and intensify in power. In fact, he predicted the rise of states like the Soviet Union and later China and so on. And Weber got that exactly right. Power will be, if the state is running the economy and there's very little or no private industry, the state will assume all power and will grow enormously in power. And that's exactly what happened. Have you ever read the book, The Black Book of Communism?
No, not really.
Read it.
I will.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And it's been out about 15 years now, something like that. It's a bunch of French, it's originally published in French, but translated quickly into English. And it's 6 French historians, and they survey the history of communism. And they, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. They conclude that about 100 million people died because of the existence of communism. 20 million in the Soviet Union, 65 million in the case of China. They're either shot, or they die of in the Chinese case, the majority died of famine because Mao thought he could run peasant farming better than the peasants who'd inherited farming methods from their ancestors for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they knew how to get the most out of their farms. But Mao knew better, so he came in and he totally reorganized peasant agriculture, and basically destroyed it.
Right.
No.
With the famine.
When the state gets involved in this, and something else I came to see, when the state gets involved in these big re-engineering products, it always produces harm. It always produces harm. People talk sometimes about the socialist countries of Scandinavia, but they're not really socialist countries. They're capitalist countries.
Right.
And they have big welfare. They have what I call welfare capitalism. They're capitalist countries that have big welfare states, bigger, more comprehensive welfare states than we have here in America. I don't know what you have in Serbia. It's a different situation. It's an Eastern European country, but
Serbia went under the transition from socialism to capitalism.
Yes.
Now it seems that it's a little worse than it was before the transition.
It's worse?
Yeah. It's really worse.
It's really worse. Because why do you think that is?
I mean, because a lot of the domestic production that we had in the socialism, like all these factories went down, and now we have a lot of foreign investments, but the wages are much lower, and the living standards of the working class are lower than it was in the Yugoslavia. Yeah. But maybe the capitalism is not the thing that caused that thing. I don't know, man. Maybe it's other factors.
The Soviet Union did tremendous harm to Eastern Europe, tremendous harm, and set those countries back 50 years at least.
Yeah, right.
And so you're suffering from the effects of Soviet domination. Well, of course, there was Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Where are you from in Serbia?
It's northern part of the Serbia, in Zrenjanin. It's a region called Vojvodina.
Yeah. And what is the biggest city there?
Novi Sad.
Novi Sad?
Yeah, Novi Sad.
I haven't been to Serbia. I have been to Prague, Budapest, Moscow, and Estonia. I was in Estonia last year for a conference.
Yeah, nice.
They're right. There were American military people there in the hotel where I was staying.
Really?
I said, "What are you guys doing here?" "Oh, we're part of I've forgotten the name of it, but they're part of a military force which is intended to prevent the Russians from coming back. They're only 2 hours from Russia. They're right there, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. And there's worry that the Russians, Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire. there was a Russian woman there at the conference. I said, "Well, how are things in Russia?" "Terrible." She said, "They're horrible. Putin is terrible. He's making things worse and worse all the time." So, and
Right.
anyway, at any rate,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so I've been in those. Go ahead.
Sorry for the interruption. Please continue.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
I'll say, yeah. People here are really nostalgic of Yugoslavia because they say, like, we had free education, free healthcare, and wages, and living conditions were good. But on the other hand, after the World War II, a lot of other capitalist countries had the same thing in their countries. So, like, they had good welfare system.
Right.
Like, I mean, Yugoslavia maybe was not so, was a nominally socialistic country, but in the essence it was a country with the capitalist mode of production, like Christopher Chase Dunn once wrote in his article about the socialism in one state.
Whose article?
Christopher Chase Dunn.
Oh, Chris, yeah, socialism in one state. Yeah,
yeah.
that's an old Marxian idea. Yeah.
Like, it's impossible to have the socialist mode of production in one country.
Yeah, because you're surrounded by all these capitalists.
Right. All right.
And if you're going to have international relations, you're going to have international relations with capitalists.
All right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was a social engineering experiment that I'm talking about communism as a whole, mainly the Soviet Union and China. It was a disaster. I mean, but big social engineering experiments usually end up as disasters, or they usually end up at least more negatively than positively. So I'm a big believer in minimal government, letting the people create. How did we create the United States? Okay, a few British people came over, then a few Germans came over, and they built everything from the ground up. They built a new form of government, a parliamentary form of government, a republic. The United States started out as a bunch of as a bunch of small merchants and farmers. All of my ancestors, they came over about 7 generations ago, and they were small farmers in Virginia for 2 or 3 generations. Then they migrated to the Midwest, to Missouri, where they became clothing merchants. So that's my background, and these are sort of the people who built America. Unfortunately, we had slavery in the South, established by the British, but people often don't realize that the vast majority of Southern whites didn't own slaves. And you know what? The number of slaves, the average number of slaves, the modal number of slaves on a slave plantation was one. Most slave owners who owned slaves had one slave.
I didn't know that.
One slave.
Right.
And that person, well, I've traced my history, my ancestry back to about 1750, to my great, 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 great grandfather. He settled in Virginia sometime in the middle of the 18th century, and he owned 2 slaves. But I think they inherited property from him. I think he had 2 blacks, but I think only one was a slave. And he had arranged in his will for them to have something. And then I think his son had a slave, but that was it. No more slaves in the Sanderson. Did you know there were slave owners who were black?
Of course, you
You
wrote
knew
about
that.
that. Yeah, and you wrote about that in your book, Modern
Oh, of
Societies.
course, of course.
Yeah,
The black slave owners up
yeah.
there.
Slavery
Of
was an
course.
economical institution, not a racial one.
That's right. So many people say, well, they enslaved these people because they were racist.
Yeah.
No, they enslaved these people because,
Cheap
well, look,
labor.
they were available, you know. Washington says, and I think he's gotten this one right, you know, why didn't they enslave? Why didn't they enslave East Indians or Chinese? What? You had to travel much farther to get them. That raises your costs of production enormously. So you go across the Atlantic and there's Africa. It's right there. There's West Africa. Boom. Well, they already have slavery in West Africa. Gee, they'll sell you slaves gladly if you give them. They liked all the cloth, the bright colored cloth that was manufactured in England and other places, and so they exchanged things, and they were racists, of course, and they did hold racist attitudes toward their slaves, but
Right.
but they didn't enslave them
Because of the race.
because of racism. They enslaved them because for economic benefit. See?
Right.
And well, yeah. So that's another fascinating topic. I'd like to read more on slavery, on the history of slavery and the reasons for abolition. Slavery, I think, eventually was no longer, at a certain point, was no longer efficient because industrial capitalism was making progress, and industrial capitalism is based on wage labor, not on slave labor. Wage labor is a more efficient form of labor than slave labor would be in an industrial form of capitalism where you have factories and you're manufacturing goods and so forth. And so, and people want to say, oh, well, we abolished slavery for moral reasons, for religious reasons. I rather doubt that, that there were moral objections. The Quakers, a religious group, they strongly objected to slavery, and there were lots of other groups who were abolitionists who strongly objected.
Yeah.
But if slavery had still been a highly productive mode of production, it would have probably been able to maintain itself. By the way, about Lincoln. Lincoln was a racist. Lincoln didn't have any particular. He wasn't really strongly opposed to slavery.
Right. I know that. Yeah, I know that.
You know all that. You know all that.
Yeah, but he was in the movement of the Enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, he wanted to keep the Union together. He wanted to preserve the Union, which was the reason for the Civil War, the preservation of the Union, not really slavery. He didn't care so much. He wasn't particularly in favor of slavery, but he didn't care so much whether it persisted or not. If he could keep the Union together, you had to preserve slavery, he would have preserved slavery.
Right.
Of course, that wouldn't be a logical thing, but Lincoln called many black leaders into the White House, and he said, look, you people are not able to compete with whites on an equal basis. You will always be held down in this country. Why don't you go somewhere else and start your own country where you can have an all-black country, and then you can rule yourselves and so forth and so on, and you don't have to compete with whites? Well, they didn't. They said no. Did you know about that?
No, I don't.
No, they said no. He called.
Really?
Yeah. He called them to the White House and he said, I think he was fairly nice about it. I have the documents to prove it. I have them in my files. The written documents. It wasn't a very long meeting. I don't think he had a very long meeting with them. And he had worked out some place in Central America where there was a great deal of land available. And he said, we can deport you. We can transport you there, and you can create your own society where you're only competing with other blacks. You won't have to compete with, because you're never going to be successful with competing with whites in America. And these, of course, were highly educated, well-off blacks that he was talking to. I don't think they were former slaves at all. They were part of the black middle class. They said no. They said no. You know why they said no?
Why? No.
I know exactly why they said no. They realized they would be better off in a society ruled by whites than in a society ruled by blacks. They may be inferior, they may be held down, they may never rise to the, they thought, they may never rise to the economic level of whites,
okay,
but they would be ruled by a white society, which would be economically and politically a much better society than ones dominated by blacks. They didn't anticipate, of course, Reconstruction, segregation, and everything that followed. I don't think it's hard to, people have a hard time looking very far ahead. People act in the short term. They're thinking of it, at most a generation ahead. What's up with their children or their grandchildren? Yeah. They don't think very far. They don't plan very far ahead, most people. But still, they were probably better off because, well, you can compare the economic situation of American blacks with the economic situation of African blacks. Well, who's better off? Well, there's no contest.
It's obvious, yeah, it's obvious.
American blacks, the average American black would be extremely wealthy in the average African country. So the blacks said no, they didn't want their own separate country. They wanted to stay in the United States and be Americans. And they did. And I guess Lincoln could not deport them. I don't think it was legal. I think it would have been against American law to deport them. They'd become citizens, you see, and you can't deport citizens. I guess that was the thinking.
Right.
Many people wanted them deported. There were many groups called Back to Africa groups that wanted them deported back to Africa, but they weren't the ones who prevailed.
Is there a racism today in the USA? Because it's often said that like institutions in the United States of America are racist per se. For example, I ask you, is there a racism today in the United States? Because
this is a huge question.
Right, because it's often said.
I'm reading a book on this right now. My answer, there's no systemic racism. You're familiar with that term that's being used now by the Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
Of course you are. There's no systemic racism. Apartheid in South Africa was systemic racism. We had systemic racism in this country up through the 1960s, but it's largely disappeared. It's disappeared from our social institutions.
Right.
Discrimination is illegal. You can be arrested and jailed for actively discriminating. Racism, there's no longer any systemic racism. There's only the racism of some individuals. How many of those? We know. There's no way of knowing. And of course, you also have to define what you mean by racism. The term is used in so many different ways now that it hardly has any stable meaning. So
it's an umbrella term.
Yeah, exactly. It's become anything you don't like, anything that happens to blacks that blacks don't like, like a microaggression or something like that, something that blacks didn't like. Well, that's racism. It's grossly overused. And there's some racism. But, when I was your age or younger, when I would say 20, I encountered a lot of racism among my friends and people I knew, there was constant racism, constant denigration of black people, constant belief that blacks were all stupid and so forth.
Right.
I encountered this practically every day. My sister's friends were all terrible. Her husband, she divorced him after 4 years, thank God for that. Oh, he was a terrible racist, terrible. You couldn't have 5 minutes of conversation with him without some racist remark.
Right.
I mean, why are these people so concerned? I was living in a community in a city in Missouri that was 3% black. What? If it's only 3% black, you're hardly ever interacting with a black person. Why would you have to talk about black people all the time? Why?
Yeah.
You're hardly ever even seeing a black person. I hardly knew a black person when I was growing up. Hardly ever knew one.
Yeah.
So.
And also there is a racial antagonism between the blacks because they don't have the same color of their skin. I mean, some of them they have the pale.
You're very well. Yes, you're very well educated and you're very, very well informed, I must say. The blacks call it colorism. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And they resent this even more than they resent light-skinned blacks even more than they resent whites. Of course, light-skinned blacks many of them are 50% white, or
right.
They saw some blacks in a commercial on television last night. Yeah. They must have been 90% white. In the old days, if a person was of mixed race but mostly white, say 80 or 90% white, they would try to pass for white for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But now they don't. Even the lightest skinned blacks, you can barely detect that they're even black. They identify as blacks now, right, because everything has changed. The status of blacks has changed dramatically. But in 1960, blacks were still a stigmatized minority, and there was still widespread and pervasive racism. So you wanted to pretend to be white and to look white enough to be accepted by other whites. We had a man in the little town I grew up in who was my dentist. He was the family dentist and he was a family friend. I believe in later years I reflected on what he looked like, and I thought this man was partly black.
Right.
He had a very broad nose. He was a little bit darker than the rest of us. He had all the frizzy hair.
Right.
The frizzy hair.
Yeah.
And a stranger came to town one day and he referred to the Negro dentist. He said something about the Negro dentist. And my father heard this and he came rushing home and said, Dr. Coleman was called a Negro dentist. I don't know what my parents thought. They never discussed it again, but then, and his children looked even blacker than he did. They didn't look like you and me.
Right.
They had a considerable proportion, and yet this man's wife she looked like a Swede. Her skin was as light as it could possibly be, like a Northern Russian or a Swede or a Finn or something like that. And so he was passing. I'm sure of it now, almost certain of it now. He's long dead, died many years ago, but he somehow passed for white, and the whites accepted him. He was a very capable man. He was a dentist. He was an excellent member of the community, and so he was a very successful black man who had passed for white.
Interesting.
You popped up in the corner here.